The story begins in a kind of silence that feels unnatural, the sort of silence that presses down on the skin like a weight. It is the winter of 1864. Across much of Europe, the nights are long, the air is cold, and the streets are lit only by faint oil lamps that seem to do little against the darkness. To a passerby, the cities would appear to be resting, the houses shuttered, smoke rising faintly from chimneys. But behind those windows, behind bolted doors, something else is happening. Families are huddled together, whispering anxiously in voices too low for the neighbors to hear. Entire districts fall asleep not from peace, but from exhaustion after another night of dread. No one dares explain exactly what they are afraid of. And even now, more than a century and a half later, historians struggle to give that fear a name. What makes this story so unsettling is not only what happened in 1864, but how little survives of it in the official record. Leaf through the archives of major cities and you will find wars carefully documented, revolutions analyzed, epidemics measured and recorded in detail. But when it comes to the winter of 1864, there are gaps, silences, odd absences. The records that do exist are often brief, contradictory, or hastily dismissed by later scholars as folklore, rumor, or collective hysteria. And yet, oral traditions, scattered diary entries, and suppressed newspapers all point to something very real, a period of mass panic so intense that entire cities seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something they could neither describe nor escape. At first glance, it is tempting to assume this was merely another outbreak of plague, or perhaps political paranoia in an age already crowded with unrest. But as you read closer, the details stop making sense. There are accounts of people refusing to leave their homes for weeks without any evidence of quarantine or epidemic. There are descriptions of markets collapsing overnight, not from lack of goods, but from a refusal of buyers to appear. One Vienna official admitted in a private letter that half the city's workers stayed home after dark, terrified of the hours when the lamps are lit. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the fear dissipated, leaving no obvious cause and no official explanation. This is where the mystery deepens. Historians are comfortable with fear when it can be explained. Fear of plague, fear of invasion, fear of famine, those are rational, even predictable. But fear without an object, without a name, without a recorded enemy, this is more dangerous. It forces us to confront the possibility that something collective and unexplainable took hold of an entire continent. It is one thing for individuals to panic, it is another for entire nations to fold into silence simultaneously. That, perhaps, is why even today scholars hesitate to speak about it, why the few who write about 1864 often use vague language, cloaking their words in academic distance, never daring to suggest the terror might have been justified. And yet, in the scraps of evidence that remain, there is an undeniable human heartbeat. A diary from a young woman in Prague describes her father refusing to let her open the shutters after dusk, not because of thieves or soldiers, but because, as he told her, it is not safe to look. In Paris, a journalist drafted an article describing the madness of the boulevards, where men who once laughed at superstition now tremble at nightfall. The article was never published, the draft survives only in the private papers of his family. In Berlin, a schoolteacher told her pupils that lessons would be cancelled until this season of silence passed. No explanation. No definition. Only silence. It is in these fragments that we catch glimpses of a collective wound that was quickly covered over, like a scar people refused to touch. The question is not only what people feared, but why they agreed never to speak of it openly again. If the danger was imaginary, why the collective vow of silence? If it was real, why no public acknowledgement? Some families preserved the memory quietly, whispering it across generations, but institutions, the universities, the governments, the churches, chose erasure. They erased so thoroughly that today, even professional historians shiver when the subject is raised, as though to remember too clearly is itself unsafe. And so we arrive at a paradox, the panic of 1864 is both everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere in the scattered remnants of testimony, in the eerie silences of the archives, in the unspoken fear that lingers in oral traditions. Nowhere in the official histories, nowhere in the textbooks, nowhere in the grand narratives of 19th-century Europe. What remains is a shadow, a whisper of a season when cities stopped trusting the night. The story you are about to hear is not one of answers neatly tied together. It is a story of fear that spread like fire across a continent and then was extinguished not by resolution, but by forgetting. Or perhaps by forceful suppression. This, more than anything else, is what makes the winter of 1864 so haunting. Fear without a name. Silence without reason. A chapter of history that refuses to stay buried, no matter how many times it is left out of the books. And before we can begin to understand why, we must first understand the Europe in which it happened, a continent already teetering at the edge, waiting for a spark. The Europe of 1864 was not a continent at peace. It was a place of borders drawn in blood, of kings and emperors clinging desperately to their thrones, of common people worn thin by famine, war, and disease. The century was only halfway through, but already it had been scarred by uprisings, cholera epidemics, and the revolutions of 1848, which had promised freedom but delivered little more than new regimes that looked remarkably like the old ones. By the time the panic arrived, the ground was already cracked. It would not have taken much for those cracks to split wide open. Factories roared in cities that had doubled in size within a generation, pulling peasants from fields into neighborhoods of soot and smoke. For some, industrialization meant opportunity, wages, a kind of modern progress. For many more, it meant exhaustion, endless shifts, and the gnawing awareness that machines were beginning to replace human hands. In Berlin, children as young as 10 were recorded working 12-hour days. In Paris, strikes were breaking out, only to be crushed by police batons. The great European capitals glittered with wealth at their centers, but their outskirts festered with poverty. It was a Europe brittle with tension, ripe for rumors, vulnerable to fear. And then there was war. Denmark was on the verge of losing Schleswig and Holstein in the Second Schleswig War, with Austria and Prussia preparing their armies. In Italy, Garibaldi's dream of unification stirred nationalist unrest. In Poland, resistance to Russian rule smoldered. These conflicts were not isolated sparks, they were symptoms of a wider unease, as if the entire continent was holding its breath, waiting for something violent, something decisive, to happen. Soldiers marched along cobblestone roads, while civilians watched them pass with faces marked by fatigue. It was not just war on the battlefield, it was war in the imagination, an ever-present reminder that life could unravel overnight. But if Europe was unstable, it was also deeply superstitious. The Church still wielded immense power in the minds of the people. Sermons warned of punishment for a sinful world, while pamphlets circulated describing comets as omens of doom. In Vienna, a rumor spread that the sky had darkened at midday, not from eclipse, but as a warning from God. In Prague, peasants whispered that animals had begun to behave strangely, dogs howling without cause, cows refusing to leave barns. These accounts were often dismissed by city officials as nonsense, yet they multiplied in diaries and letters. The people, at least, were listening. And in listening, they grew afraid. It is important to imagine the soundscape of the time. No electric hum, no constant background of engines or machines. At night, silence was nearly total, broken only by the creak of wood, the distant clatter of hooves, the bark of a dog. In such a silence, the smallest disturbance, a shout, a cry, a strange echo, could take on terrifying proportions. One witness in Munich later recalled lying awake in his bed and hearing what he thought was a rolling sound, like 1,000 carts passing through the street. But when he rose to look, the street was empty. He never knew if the sound was real or imagined. What mattered was how quickly fear spread from house to house, whispered in the dark until it became truth. Historians often debate how much the press contributed. By the mid-19th century, newspapers were widely read, carried from coffeehouses to train stations, shaping the mood of entire populations. In the months before the panic, reports appeared of strange disturbances, unexplained fires, sudden deaths, even ghostly apparitions. Many were written in sensational tones to sell copies. But once the panic began, something stranger happened. Coverage abruptly dropped. Entire newspapers that had been filled with lurid headlines suddenly fell quiet, printing nothing more than crop prices or government decrees. Some scholars argue this silence was imposed by authorities desperate to prevent hysteria. Others suggest editors themselves were too afraid to keep writing. Whatever the reason, the sudden absence of explanation only deepened the mystery. In the personal writings that survive, what stands out is not just fear, but confusion. People did not know what they were supposed to be afraid of. In Budapest, one teacher wrote that his students refused to walk home after sunset because their parents forbade it. When he asked what danger they feared, none of them could answer clearly. Some said thieves, others said demons, a few simply shrugged and said, "It is not safe." In Paris, a woman recorded in her journal that neighbors had stopped speaking in the stairwell of her building, as though conversation itself might invite something listening in the dark. Fear without a name, that was the most terrifying thing of all. We should not underestimate how fragile life felt in 1864. Illness could strike without warning, and medicine offered little more than hope and prayer. Food shortages were common, many lived one bad harvest away from hunger. For the ordinary person, life was always at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Perhaps this made people more ready to believe that invisible threats might descend without warning. And perhaps this is why, when the first sparks of panic appeared in January, they spread so quickly across borders. What began as a whisper in one town became a rumor in another, until it grew into a wave rolling over Europe. Still, what makes the winter of 1864 extraordinary is not merely that fear spread, but that it left behind so little in the way of evidence. Unlike cholera or famine, it cannot be traced through death records. Unlike revolutions, it left no manifestos, no speeches, no declarations of victory or defeat. What it left was silence. Authorities did not document it, churches avoided mention in their records, and later historians brushed it aside as trivial. But to the people who lived through it, the fear was as real as war, as tangible as hunger. It warped behavior, altered routines, emptied streets, and shuttered businesses. Entire communities moved in rhythm with something unseen. When the season ended, Europe moved on, pretending nothing had happened. But the traces remain, in the gaps, the absences, the awkward silences of the historical record. And those silences are often more revealing than words. They suggest that something occurred, something powerful enough to frighten governments, priests, and scholars into forgetting. What exactly that something was, however, remains elusive. The silence of the record is the silence of fear. It is the silence that tells us Europe was already brittle, already waiting for an excuse to collapse inward. And in January of 1864, that excuse finally arrived. A spark in a single city that spread across borders faster than fire, igniting a panic still unexplained. But to understand it, we have to look at how it began, at the first strange reports that turned unease into terror. It began quietly, in the sort of way history often forgets, a rumor spoken too many times, a strange event repeated until it carried the weight of truth. The first sparks appeared in January 1864. The details change depending on who tells the story, but every version begins with something small, something that might have been ignored if the world around it had not already been so tense. In Vienna, one report spoke of a man collapsing suddenly in the street, his eyes wide open, muttering words that no one could understand. He died before morning. The doctor who examined him found no wound, no illness he could identify. He simply noted unnatural fright as the cause of death. In Prague, a schoolgirl was said to have fainted after claiming to see a shadow moving against the church wall long after midnight. In Paris, letters mention people gathered on balconies staring at the sky, pointing at something they insisted was there, though not everyone agreed on what they saw. For some, it was lights like torches floating above the horizon, for others, a shifting dark mass, too large to be human. And in Munich, a baker recorded that customers refused to buy bread baked that day because the grain itself was cursed. These moments on their own could have been dismissed as paranoia, bad luck, even coincidence. But together, they created a pattern, a pulse of unease moving across cities that otherwise had little in common. At first it was curiosity, neighbors gossiping about what had been seen, men laughing at taverns about ghosts in the street. Yet beneath the laughter was a tightening of the chest, the kind that grows when the joke is not quite funny. What makes this period so slippery to historians is the inconsistency of the accounts. One man swore he saw a procession of pale figures moving silently along the road at dusk, only to find no footprints left behind. Another claimed that at exactly midnight, all the lamps in his quarter of Vienna went out at once, though the city kept no record of a failure in its lighting system. A farmer outside Krakow insisted he heard the tolling of church bells in the night, though no church had rung them. And yet, for every person who spoke of such things, another swore they had seen nothing at all. Fear and disbelief walked hand in hand, fueling one another. Local officials were quick to try and control the panic. In Dresden, a decree was issued: citizens were not to leave their homes after nightfall. The reason? None was given. In Paris, patrols of police were sent to keep watch on the streets, though they were ordered not to explain what they were watching for. The effect was the opposite of reassurance. Nothing drives fear deeper than silence from those in power. If the authorities refused to name the danger, people began to name it themselves. Whispers of spirits, demons, and portents passed from household to household. In Prague, a priest told his congregation that the fear was punishment for abandoning faith. "Close your windows," he warned, "for evil walks the streets." In Berlin, a doctor argued that it was madness, hysteria infecting one mind after another. His words did little to calm his patients, especially when one of them was found dead in bed the next morning, his face frozen in a grimace of terror. Newspapers, at first eager to feed on the sensational stories, suddenly grew cautious. Reports became vague. Descriptions grew abstract. A disturbance occurred, one German paper admitted, but the matter is resolved. No details. No explanation. And yet, the stories kept coming. In village squares, people whispered of hearing footsteps that did not belong to anyone, of shutters banging though the air was still. Children woke screaming in the night, claiming something was outside their window. Farmers refused to take carts into the fields before sunrise. Merchants left their stalls empty at twilight. The economy began to strain, not from war or famine, but from simple refusal to live life after dark. Eyewitnesses describe a collective exhaustion settling over their towns. Imagine an entire city functioning only in daylight, every soul rushing to finish their errands before the sun dipped below the horizon. Streets that once bustled with evening chatter became ghostly quiet. Lamps burned to empty squares. The absence of life itself was a spectacle. And when silence grows heavy, the imagination begins to supply what the ear cannot hear. Not everyone was willing to stay quiet. A few dared to write down what they saw, though most of those accounts never made it to the public. One young man, a law student in Vienna, described hearing a deep hum, like metal grinding, but stretched across the whole sky. He insisted dozens of others heard it too. His diary ends abruptly after this entry, with no further pages surviving. In Warsaw, a pamphlet circulated briefly, warning of spectral armies seen on the horizon at dusk, before being confiscated by police. Some copies were burned. The handful that survive in archives are brittle with age but filled with frantic underlinings, as though the writer himself could not believe the words he was setting down. By February, fear had hardened into routine. Families shut their doors tight at sunset. Curtains were drawn, candles kept low. No one wanted to be the one who looked outside and saw what the others refused to name. The very act of looking became dangerous. As one witness put it, to see was to know, and to know was to be marked. And so, the panic spread, one house to the next, one city to another, until entire populations lived in enforced blindness, refusing the night. Yet, despite the scale of it, despite the way it altered daily life, governments and newspapers maintained a careful silence. They issued decrees, yes, but gave no reasons. They acknowledged fear, but not its cause. This silence was fuel. The more the authorities refused to explain, the more the people invented their own explanations. Some claimed soldiers had seen visions on the battlefield, that something not human moved among the dead. Others said the church knew the truth but was too afraid to speak it. A few believed that scholars had uncovered forbidden knowledge, something buried too long. But in every version, the implication was the same: someone knew, and they were not telling. This is the point where curiosity turned into dread. When people began to realize that they were not just afraid of shadows, but of silence itself. A silence from their leaders, from their priests, from the very institutions meant to protect them. And if those voices would not name the danger, then perhaps the danger was worse than anyone imagined. By the spring of 1864, entire cities were caught in the grip of this unspoken terror. And yet, as strange as this sounds, official records insist that nothing unusual occurred. Nothing, despite streets emptied at night, despite diaries filled with trembling hands, despite decrees banning movement after dusk. The contradiction is staggering. And it is this contradiction, the split between lived experience and written history, that has left the panic of 1864 shrouded in mystery. The spark had been lit. The fire was spreading. But what happens when an entire population begins to live in fear of its own streets, its own shadows, its own silence? That is the story of the next chapter, when cities themselves became prisons of dread. By the time February bled into March of 1864, the panic was no longer a whisper, it was a way of life. Entire cities across Europe began to transform in ways that, even now, feel unreal. It was as if invisible hands had reached into the daily routines of millions and turned them inside out. Markets still opened, factories still produced, and governments still ruled, but beneath the surface lay a collective terror that reshaped every corner of society. The world of daylight persisted, the world of night had become uninhabitable. In Vienna, records suggest that taverns, normally packed with men drinking long into the night, emptied before dusk. One innkeeper noted bitterly in his ledger that he sold more ale in the afternoon than in entire weeks of evenings. In Berlin, the theaters, once glittering with chandeliers and velvet curtains, closed their doors as actors refused to perform after dark. Paris, the self-proclaimed city of light, dimmed into something unrecognizable. The boulevards, once vibrant with gas lamps and chatter, grew so silent that the faint sound of a horse's hooves echoed for blocks. And still, if one turned to the newspapers of the time, the official story was of calm and stability. Nothing unusual, nothing worth alarm. Yet diaries and private letters paint a different picture: parents forbidding their children to peek through shutters, shopkeepers locking doors hours earlier than before, families clustering in single rooms to pray together as the sun dipped below the horizon. Fear shaped the clock itself. Daytime became compressed, frantic, a race to finish tasks before the sky changed color. Night was not rest, it was endurance. One of the most striking accounts comes from Prague, where a young mother wrote that her children refused to sleep in their own beds, insisting on sharing hers. She described how the youngest would wake in tears, insisting that something was moving in the street. When she finally dared to look through the crack in her shutters, she saw nothing but the stillness of an empty road. And yet, she confessed, the fear she felt in that moment, though she had seen nothing, was overwhelming. The silence itself, she wrote, was alive. This silence became the defining sound of Europe in those months. Streets that once rang with songs, clattering carts, and gossip now seemed hollow. It was not merely quiet, it was absence, an absence that pressed on the ears until people thought they could hear things that were not there. A scratch at the door. A whisper outside the window. A low vibration that might have been the wind, or might have been something else. The silence was not empty. It was charged. Priests seized upon this fear to frame sermons as warnings. In Paris, one priest thundered from the pulpit that God had loosed an angel of death, stalking the boulevards at night. In Vienna, a bishop urged his flock to remain indoors after sunset, declaring that temptation walks most freely when the lamps are lit. But religion offered little comfort. If anything, such words only made the fear more tangible, as if even the church was confessing it had no power to protect. Meanwhile, doctors and scientists offered explanations that were often more frightening than the rumors they sought to disprove. In Berlin, a physician suggested the panic might be caused by vapors rising from the ground, poisoning the air at night. His theory spread quickly, convincing some families to burn herbs in their homes to ward off unseen toxins. Others believed the fear itself was contagious, a madness leaping from neighbor to neighbor. But if this was true, why were officials so silent? Why were the papers so careful to avoid specifics? Why did decrees banning movement after dark speak only of public safety without saying what threatened it? The contradiction became unbearable. Cities were behaving as though under siege, yet the official word was that nothing was wrong. The gap between lived reality and recorded truth widened into a chasm, and into that space poured suspicion. Were the authorities hiding something? Were they protecting the people from knowledge too terrible to share? Or were they simply as afraid as everyone else? The economic consequences were real enough. In Prague and Vienna, reports show factories losing nearly half their workforce on night shifts. In Paris, bakers could no longer rely on early morning deliveries because drivers refused to travel in darkness. In Berlin, city officials quietly documented a 30% drop in evening commerce. None of this appeared in public reports, but the ledgers and private complaints reveal a Europe that was, in effect, shutting itself down for half the day. And through it all, the human stories grew stranger. In Dresden, families claimed to see shadows moving across walls when no one stood near. In Munich, a witness swore that he heard singing in the streets though no singer could be found. In Krakow, townspeople told of a low hum filling the air at dusk, like a swarm of bees stretched across the sky. The same hum would later be reported in Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, always at nightfall, always accompanied by a spike in fear. The detail is too consistent to ignore, yet too elusive to explain. Children seemed especially sensitive to the dread. Teachers complained of empty classrooms, of students arriving pale and sleepless. One girl in Warsaw refused to enter the schoolyard at dawn, insisting that the ground still remembers the night. Parents struggled to comfort them, but how do you reassure a child when you yourself are afraid to open the window? By March, some towns looked like ghost cities after sundown. Travelers reported walking through streets so deserted that they could not believe the population was still alive. Windows glowed faintly with candlelight, but doors were locked, shutters sealed. The streets were abandoned, not by force, not by decree, but by choice. Collective choice. Fear had become the law, unspoken yet absolute. And then came the numbers. Historians who later combed through municipal records noticed strange statistics. In some towns, as many as half the inhabitants simply stopped appearing in the evening. Work attendance plummeted, taverns and theaters closed, even churches began holding services only in daylight hours. Yet none of this was officially acknowledged. Reports of normal conditions were filed year after year, as if the winter of 1864 had been like any other. The silence was deliberate. The question, then, is why? Why erase such a massive, visible disruption? Why pretend it never happened? Was it shame, embarrassment that an entire continent could succumb to fear of nothing at all? Or was it something darker, a choice to bury evidence of a truth no one wanted to face? By the spring of 1864, Europe was caught in the grip of a contradiction too large to sustain. Cities lived in terror, yet governments insisted life was ordinary. Ordinary citizens whispered of shadows and sounds in the night, while newspapers printed only crop yields and political speeches. The tension between silence and reality was unbearable. Something had to give. And indeed, in the months that followed, a new kind of silence began to emerge, this time not from fear alone, but from deliberate suppression. Those who tried to write, to record, to preserve the truth of what happened in those streets began to find themselves silenced as well. Some by censorship. Some by ridicule. And a few, chillingly, by disappearance. The silence of 1864 was not just the silence of empty streets. It was also the silence imposed on those who tried to speak. If ordinary citizens were too afraid to leave their homes after dark, there were still some who believed it their duty to record what was happening, to give words to the terror. They were journalists, doctors, priests, teachers, and scholars. And yet, their voices are today fragments, censored, or lost altogether. A Prague journalist named Janek Novotny provides one of the earliest examples. He had begun writing articles on what he called the nightly disturbances. In his surviving drafts, he described neighbors gathering by candlelight, refusing to look out of windows, and streets that seemed hollow, as though the city itself were holding its breath. He sent his reports to 3 different newspapers. None were published. Weeks later, Novotny himself vanished. His apartment was found locked, his belongings untouched, his papers gone. All that remains is one draft article, discovered decades later in his family's attic, bearing his final line, "The city fears something it dares not name." The story of Novotny is not unique. Across Europe, those who attempted to document the panic often found their work suppressed. In Vienna, a physician named Dr. Matthias Grun compiled case notes on patients who exhibited symptoms of terror without cause, insomnia, hallucinations, even sudden death by fright. His notes, however, were confiscated when he attempted to present them at a medical society. Officially, he was told his findings lacked rigor. Unofficially, colleagues whispered that the police had taken interest in his work. Dr. Grun died suddenly a year later, his notes never recovered. Clergy were no safer. A parish priest in Krakow filled his sermons with references to the dark hour and the voices outside. He was reprimanded by his bishop, ordered to stop. His private journals, what little survive, suggest he feared punishment not only from God, but from authorities determined to keep such talk from spreading. One entry reads, "I will not speak of it again. I value my parish, but I fear their silence more than the shadows." The pattern is uncanny. Whenever an individual tried to capture the events of 1864 in writing, their words either disappeared or survived only in fragments. A Parisian student published a short pamphlet describing phantoms in the boulevards. Within days, the pamphlet was withdrawn, and the student was expelled from his university. In Dresden, a teacher who kept a diary of her pupils' strange behavior, refusing to go home after class, bursting into tears at the sight of dusk, was dismissed without explanation. Her diary, discovered years later, ends mid-sentence. Historians who examined these fragments in the 20th century noted something chilling: the erasure is too consistent to be coincidence. Too many records vanish at precisely the same point. Too many accounts end in sudden silence. It is as though the panic itself was not the only thing people feared, the act of remembering became dangerous too. One of the most haunting examples is the diary of a young scholar in Berlin. His name has been lost, but his final entry survives in quotation, copied by a friend before the original disappeared. The line is brief, and offers no explanation, only a plea: "They are coming at night." This is not hysteria. No one knows who they were. The diary vanished soon after. The scholar himself was said to have left the city, though no records confirm where he went. It is tempting to imagine conspiracy, to picture governments actively hunting down and destroying such records. And yet, there is little direct evidence of official orders. Some historians argue instead for self-censorship, editors unwilling to stoke panic, bishops eager to maintain order, universities too proud to admit collective fear. Others suspect a coordinated effort, governments embarrassed by mass hysteria in their cities, deciding it was better to erase than explain. Either way, the result is the same: silence, a silence that deepened with every suppressed voice. But silence can never be perfect. Tiny cracks in the wall remain. A letter here, a footnote there, a half-remembered sermon whispered in oral tradition. These fragments form a pattern too striking to ignore. They show people desperate to make sense of a fear they could not name. Some thought it illness. Others thought it divine punishment. Still others were convinced it was something unnatural, something moving in the streets that no one dared confront. For those who tried to speak publicly, the consequences could be dire. A doctor in Paris was reported to have been discouraged from publishing a pamphlet on mass hysteria. Within months, he abandoned his practice and left the city entirely. No explanation. In Warsaw, a schoolteacher vanished after attempting to publish a collection of his pupils' strange nighttime drawings. Some of the sketches survive, dark, childlike images of towering shapes outside windows, of figures without faces standing beneath lamps. They were dismissed as childish nightmares. But nightmares have roots, and in 1864, those roots ran deep. The most unnerving detail is not what remains, but what does not. Entire issues of newspapers are missing from archives. University records skip weeks at a time. Municipal reports from February and March of 1864 are intact in one year, absent in the next. This kind of silence does not happen by accident. It suggests active removal, by whom, and for what reason, we may never know. What remains are the human echoes, a journalist who never came home, a doctor whose notes were seized, a priest who stopped speaking, a scholar whose last words warned of something coming at night. Individually, these stories might be dismissed as coincidence, bad luck, or paranoia. Together, they sketch the outline of a chilling pattern. Those who looked too closely into the fear of 1864 were silenced, whether by force, by intimidation, or by their own terror. And so, history has been left with gaps where the most important testimonies should be. The people who lived through the panic were not allowed, or did not dare, to leave a clear record. The result is an event at once vast and elusive, witnessed by millions yet remembered only in fragments. The silenced witnesses are more than missing voices, they are warnings. Warnings that to name what happened in 1864 carried consequences, that even remembering it was risky. Which raises a question: if the danger was imaginary, why erase it so thoroughly? And if it was real, what could have been so terrible that silence itself seemed the only option? That question becomes even more pressing in the next part of the story, where we find that not only the witnesses, but even those tasked with investigating the panic, the governments, the historians, the record keepers, would quietly abandon their work, leaving behind an investigation that, officially, never existed. If the winter of 1864 was a season of silence for ordinary people, it became something even stranger for those charged with understanding and documenting it. In theory, governments, scholars, and historians should have been the ones to provide clarity, to explain what had unsettled so many lives. Yet when we follow the paper trail, we find not clarity but erasure. The investigation into the panic, if it can even be called that, left almost nothing behind. It is as though Europe collectively decided not just to forget, but to forbid remembering. We know from scattered correspondence that local councils held emergency meetings in several cities. Minutes survive from Berlin describing irregularities in public order during February and March. They acknowledge curfews, absentee workers, and unrest caused by rumor. But then, abruptly, the record breaks off. No follow-up. No resolutions. The entries skip ahead as though nothing had been discussed. In Vienna, the council minutes for February are missing entirely, replaced with a note, "See Annex documents." No annexes remain. The gaps are too consistent, too surgical, to be explained by chance. In Paris, a police prefect named Charles Duval allegedly compiled reports from across the city describing the eerie abandonment of streets after dark. These reports included testimony from patrolmen who swore they had heard singing without singers, and footsteps without figures. But Duval's file vanished from the archives. What survives is only a letter he sent to the Minister of the Interior, warning, "It is not only the people who are afraid. My men are afraid as well." The minister never replied, or if he did, the letter is gone. University scholars fared little better. In Prague, a group of academics convened to study what they tentatively called the night terrors. They gathered eyewitness accounts, attempted to map the spread of panic, even drew up hypotheses, ranging from mass hallucination to atmospheric disturbance. And then, without explanation, their work ended. One member later confided to a student that the project had been discouraged. He did not elaborate. Within a year, the subject was never mentioned in faculty meetings again. Their notes destroyed. Historians who later stumbled across traces of these abandoned investigations were baffled. Why would governments and scholars ignore an event that had paralyzed entire cities? Fear of ridicule is one possibility. No ruler wants to admit that his subjects cowered from shadows. No professor wants to be remembered as the man who studied ghosts. And yet, the deeper one looks, the less convincing embarrassment becomes as an explanation. The erasures are too deliberate. Too coordinated. Consider this: municipal records from Berlin and Vienna both contain missing weeks at exactly the same time. Not damaged, not lost in fire or flood, missing. As though someone deliberately removed them. In Paris, newspapers that had once fed on sensationalism abruptly fell silent together, as if obeying an order. In Prague, multiple diaries end on the same dates, their writers promising to continue but never resuming. Coincidence stretches thin when the pattern repeats across borders. Some researchers suggest there may have been a coordinated European effort to suppress the memory of 1864. This was, after all, an age of fragile governments, of monarchies desperate to maintain control over restless populations. Admitting that whole cities had succumbed to unreason would have undermined their authority. Better to erase, to leave no trace, than to allow future generations to question the stability of their rulers. If this was the plan, it worked. The panic is barely remembered today, and when it is often dismissed as folklore. But others believe the suppression was not political embarrassment, it was fear. Not fear of ridicule, but fear of something that could not be explained. In one fragment of a letter from a Bavarian official, he warns a colleague, "Do not speak of the nights." It invites them. The wording is cryptic, but it suggests that even officials believed silence was a form of protection. By refusing to name what had happened, they could contain it. Or at least, they hoped they could. There are also the deaths. A handful of early investigators who tried to pursue the subject did not live long enough to publish. A young scholar in Vienna was said to have thrown himself into the Danube after weeks of studying witness testimony. In Berlin, a historian collapsed of a sudden seizure while preparing a lecture on the events. In Paris, a police archivist died in what was described as an accident, crushed beneath falling shelves of records. These deaths may have been coincidence. Or perhaps they became part of the story, a grim reminder that to probe too deeply into the panic was to invite misfortune. Even in the decades that followed, the fear of 1864 clung to scholars like a shadow. When late 19th century historians assembled comprehensive national histories, they skipped over the winter almost entirely. Wars were covered in detail, famines analyzed, epidemics charted, but the panic? At best, a footnote. At worst, nothing. And when younger students asked about the missing months, their professors deflected with vague words: a season of unrest, popular delusion, not worthy of serious study. The silence became tradition. In the 20th century, when archives were revisited, researchers found locked drawers, restricted files, and sealed documents marked not to be opened until the year 2064. What possible reason could there be to keep documents sealed for 200 years? The implication is disturbing. Either the contents were deemed dangerous, or someone wanted to ensure the memory of 1864 would die with those who lived it. And yet, scraps still survive. A single page from the lost Berlin Council minutes mentions phenomena inexplicable to reason. A fragment of a Vienna report notes the necessity of controlling fear as much as controlling disease. A Parisian officer scribbled in the margin of his patrol log, "We heard them again tonight." Who they were, the note does not say. Each fragment teases without answering. Each suggests that something was seen, heard, or felt, but never named. And when we step back, the picture that emerges is one of deliberate abandonment. The investigation was not concluded. It was abandoned. Not because answers were found, but because the questions themselves were too dangerous. This is why modern historians often speak of the investigation that never was. On paper, it seems as though no serious study was ever attempted. In reality, the studies were begun, and then buried. The work was done in secret, erased in silence, and left behind only the faintest traces. Enough to prove that something was there, but never enough to know what it was. It is this absence that haunts the story of 1864 more than any rumor of shadows or sounds. Governments and scholars alike chose not to look too closely, not to preserve what they found. And in that decision, they left us with a mystery more enduring than any explanation. What could have been so terrible, so destabilizing, that silence seemed safer than truth? Was it embarrassment, fear, or something stranger still? The further we dig, the more unsettling the picture becomes. Because when we turn to the accounts of ordinary people, the stories whispered from parent to child, the legends preserved in family memory, we find details so eerie that they blur the line between folklore and reality. Stories of the unnatural. Stories of things that walked in the night. Stories that refused to vanish, no matter how carefully the archives tried to erase them. What lingers longest from 1864 are not the official records, they were erased. What survives are the whispers, the fragments of folklore, the half-remembered stories told in kitchens, around hearths, and later, in hushed tones to children who were warned never to repeat them outside the family. It is in these scraps of oral tradition that the panic of 1864 takes on its most haunting form, slipping across the boundary between history and legend. For while scholars tried to frame the fear as hysteria, the people themselves described something else, not just fear of the unknown, but encounters with the uncanny. The most widespread motif is sound. In dozens of accounts, witnesses described hearing noises that had no visible source. A low humming, like the vibration of distant machinery. Rhythmic pounding, like boots on cobblestone, though the streets were empty. In Paris, residents along the Rue Saint-Honoré reported a chorus of voices, men chanting in a language none could recognize. Some said the sound came from beneath the ground, others that it drifted from the air above. When men gathered courage to investigate, they found nothing. Yet the moment they returned indoors, the noises resumed. In Prague, children told of a singing under the floorboards. A mother wrote in her diary that her son refused to sleep in his room, claiming that voices were rising from the cellar. When she descended with a lamp to prove him wrong, she too heard faint murmurs, as if dozens of people were whispering below the stone. She fled, and the family sealed the cellar door. For weeks afterward, neighbors claimed they could hear the whispers from the street. The second motif is shadow. Many accounts speak not of figures, but of shapes that seem to move in the corner of the eye. One Viennese watchman swore he saw an army of silhouettes marching down the Ringstrasse at midnight. Yet when he raised his lantern, the street was empty. In Dresden, a teacher described walking home after evening class and noticing that her own shadow was not alone, beside her stretched 3 others, though no one else was near. She ran, and the shadows kept pace. The most disturbing reports came from Berlin, where multiple witnesses claimed to see a black procession moving silently through the streets. Not carriages, not soldiers, but long columns of faceless forms that left no footprints. They passed quickly, always just beyond reach of lantern light. Some who saw them swore they felt a sudden pressure in the chest, as though air itself had grown heavy. Others fainted outright. And then there are the disappearances. Oral traditions across different countries agree on a peculiar detail: those who stared too long at the shadow sometimes failed to return home. In Warsaw, a market woman was said to have vanished after insisting on following the invisible choir she heard near her stall. In Vienna, 2 brothers chased what they believed to be a phantom procession into a narrow alley. They never returned. Their family searched until dawn. The alley was empty. Skeptics might dismiss these as exaggerations, products of frightened imaginations during a tense political era. But when dozens of unrelated accounts describe the same motifs, sounds without source, shadows without bodies, vanishings without explanation, it becomes harder to ignore. Especially when many of these accounts never entered print, never reached the public stage, but were preserved privately in diaries or family stories. They were not crafted for audiences. They were whispered warnings. A folklorist in the early 20th century, decades after the panic, interviewed elderly villagers in Bavaria about their memories of 1864. What he found was chillingly consistent. One after another, the villagers described the black nights, when no one dared to step outside because they were walking. Who they were, the villagers could not, or would not, explain. Some called them the faceless. Others simply gestured to the window and whispered, "You must not watch them pass." Similar stories appear in Poland, in Hungary, even as far west as Spain. They differ in detail but share a common theme, a presence that moved through the streets at night, a presence you must never acknowledge. To look too closely was to invite disaster. What makes these accounts especially haunting is how they were framed. Unlike typical ghost stories, they lack the moralizing element, the lesson about sin or virtue. There is no cause, no explanation, no resolution. The shadows and voices are not spirits seeking justice, not omens of plague or war. They are simply there, alien, inexplicable, and terrifying. They exist outside narrative. That, perhaps, is why people feared them so deeply. They offered no story, only dread. And yet, the folklore carries a strange consistency of imagery, almost as if different cultures were describing the same event in their own words. The faceless processions in Berlin echo the invisible choir in Paris. The marching silhouettes in Vienna echo the extra shadows in Dresden. It is as though the panic was less a collection of random hallucinations than a single shared experience refracted across Europe. Some folklorists argue these tales represent an early form of collective trauma, memories reshaped into supernatural symbols. But others note that the consistency across borders suggests something more, either a rumor that spread with astonishing speed, or a phenomenon that genuinely occurred in multiple cities at once. Neither explanation is entirely comforting. The uncanny details also appear in artwork. Surviving sketches from 1864, drawn by children, show streets filled with towering black figures, mouths wide but eyes blank. One chilling drawing from Krakow depicts a family huddled in their house while enormous silhouettes peer through the window. Scholars debate whether these were merely childish nightmares, but nightmares have roots, and these were shared across hundreds of miles. By the time these stories were recorded decades later, many of the tellers still refused to elaborate. Some lowered their voices, glancing at the door as though the very act of speaking might summon what they described. One elderly woman told a folklorist, "We were told not to say their name, and so I will not. They walked, and that is enough." For historians, this presents a dilemma. Do we dismiss such accounts as folklore, valuable only for understanding fear, not reality? Or do we treat them as testimonies of something unexplainable, something that slipped into the historical record only in whispers? Either way, they cannot be ignored. They represent the lived experience of those who endured 1864, not what governments chose to record, but what people remembered in their bones. And it is precisely these whispered accounts that make the silence of official archives even more suspicious. If nothing happened, why erase the records? If it was only hysteria, why not publish it as such? The folklore suggests that what occurred was more than imagination. People across Europe described not just fear, but encounters, with something they could neither name nor endure. Whether hallucination, mass psychosis, or something far stranger, the supernatural explanations were not simply legends told later. They were lived in the moment. Families sealed their doors, not because of politics or plague, but because of voices outside, shadows on the street, shapes at the window. For them, it was real enough to hide from. Real enough to remember, even when forbidden. And here lies the most unsettling question: if the people of 1864 truly believed they had encountered something in the night, did the government suppress the panic because it embarrassed them, or because they feared it was true? The answer lies, perhaps, in the next set of accounts, the investigations that strayed too close to these folkloric stories, the men who tried to pursue not the rational explanations, but the irrational. Men who sought the supernatural in the archives, and who found their own lives unraveling in the process. By the late 19th century, the official world had closed its doors on the memory of 1864. Governments locked their files, universities discouraged discussion, and newspapers moved on. But silence does not kill curiosity, it sharpens it. Among the fringes of academia and the margins of society, there were always those who could not let go. For them, the whispers of 1864 were not embarrassing footnotes but irresistible mysteries. They believed the silence itself proved there was something to find. And some went looking. One of the earliest was a German historian named Friedrich Kessler, a man known more for his eccentricity than his scholarship. In the 1880s, Kessler began publishing pamphlets claiming that the events of 1864 had been deliberately erased from European memory. He accused governments of conspiring to hide what he called the Black Nights. His evidence was scattered: missing council minutes, sealed police reports, contradictory diaries. But he insisted the gaps were intentional. His colleagues dismissed him as paranoid. Yet in private letters, even some who mocked him admitted unease. His methods are unsound, one wrote, but the silences he points to are real. Kessler's obsession grew darker. He began corresponding with spiritualist circles in London, convinced that seances could reveal what the archives refused to say. He claimed that during one session, a medium spoke in a voice not her own, whispering, "They march still." Whether fabrication or hallucination, the experience pushed him further. By 1892, Kessler disappeared from public life. Rumors claimed he had moved into a remote farmhouse, filling its cellar with copied testimonies and forbidden books. When he died, the farmhouse was nearly empty. Only a single notebook remained, containing one chilling sentence: "They are not gone. They are only waiting." Kessler was not alone. Across Europe, a handful of occultists seized on the silence of 1864 as proof of supernatural intrusion. In Paris, members of the Société des Invisibles insisted the panic had been caused by what they called the procession of faceless ones. They held midnight vigils, hoping to summon the same presences that terrified their parents. In Prague, a circle of mystics argued that the sounds of 1864 were not hallucinations but echoes of another world brushing against ours. They treated the humming and chanting as a kind of message, though one no human could translate. Most of these groups collapsed under ridicule, but their records, fragmentary as they are, reveal the persistence of belief. Even 40 years later, people were still convinced that what happened in 1864 was no mere panic. They were convinced that something had walked through Europe that winter, something that could not be explained. Not all investigators were occultists. In 1908, a young Czech historian named Helena Procházková tried to approach the mystery scientifically. She compiled dozens of oral histories from elderly villagers who remembered being children in 1864. Her work was careful, methodical, even skeptical. And yet, the stories she collected unsettled her. Too many witnesses spoke of shadows that moved without bodies, of neighbors who vanished after looking outside. Helena presented her findings at a small academic gathering in Brno. The reaction was swift and brutal. Senior professors accused her of indulging superstition. One scolded her for wasting time on a phantom. She was denied further funding. Within months, her research was shelved. The few manuscripts she prepared disappeared into university archives and were never published. Helena herself abandoned academia, retreating to private teaching. But decades later, a student remembered her saying, "It is not superstition. It is something we are not allowed to see." This pattern repeated across Europe. Every generation or two, someone, an amateur historian, an ambitious student, an occultist, would return to the mystery. They would gather fragments, point to the gaps, insist the silence meant something. And almost every time, their work would vanish, their careers collapse, or their reputations crumble. It was as though the very subject was cursed. But the most disturbing cases are those where the investigators themselves began to experience what they studied. A French researcher in the 1920s claimed he began hearing the same humming described in Paris 60 years earlier. He wrote in his journal, "At night I hear them, as if under the floor." Weeks later, his neighbors found him gone. His apartment was locked from the inside. In Vienna, an occultist named Karl Stein insisted he had discovered the truth, that the Panic of 1864 was caused by a procession of the dead, souls who had been denied burial after war and famine. He believed the faceless forms were a vast army of restless spirits, crossing Europe in search of peace. He wrote a book about it, self-published in 1931. Within a year, every copy had disappeared. Collectors searched for decades, but none surfaced. Only a few quotations survive in later writings. One passage reads, "They will march again when silence returns." Stein himself died in obscurity, his theories dismissed as madness. These investigators occupy a strange space in history, half scholars, half outcasts, trapped between curiosity and fear. Their persistence raises unsettling questions. Why did they risk careers, reputations, even sanity to pursue a story the world had chosen to forget? And why did so many meet tragic or bizarre ends? Coincidence can explain some. But when the same pattern repeats across countries and generations, coincidence begins to feel like denial. For modern audiences, the tales of these doomed investigators are more than eerie anecdotes. They remind us that the Panic of 1864 did not simply vanish. It lingered, resurfacing whenever someone dared to probe too deeply. Each attempt to expose it ended in silence, as though the mystery itself resisted illumination. As though remembering was forbidden. And so the question remains, was this merely the fate of those too obsessed with folklore? Or was there truly something lurking in the forgotten winter of 1864, something that reached out to claim those who stared too closely? The next part of the story may bring us closer. Because hidden within private letters and restricted archives are fragments that suggest the panic was not only a psychological contagion, not only folklore, but something that left measurable traces. Unexplained deaths. Sudden disappearances. Records of bodies found in the streets, their faces twisted not by disease, but by terror. The folklore of 1864, the shadows, the humming, the faceless processions, can be dismissed as stories. The silenced journalists and lost scholars can be written off as victims of censorship or obsession. But what cannot be dismissed so easily are the bodies. For while the official histories of Europe in that year remain silent, the medical records and local parish logs whisper another truth: people died, and not in ways that fit the neat categories of disease or accident. A parish register from Vienna records a curious surge of sudden deaths by fright during the first quarter of 1864. The phrase itself is unusual. Death certificates of the era typically listed cholera, consumption, typhus, ordinary killers. But for nearly 36 individuals, priests and doctors wrote a stranger cause, Schreck, terror. These were not people struck by plague or famine. They were men and women who, according to their families, simply collapsed after encounters with nothing visible. One entry notes, Frau Gertrude M., age 41, expired after shrieking at an empty window. Another, child, 9 years, perished of fright, saying, "They are here," before death. In Berlin, hospital reports tell a similar story. Admissions during February and March included dozens of patients suffering extreme anxiety, trembling, hallucinations. Physicians use terms like night mania or phantasm sickness. One doctor wrote that his patients were otherwise healthy but wasted away from sheer exhaustion, as if unable to sleep for weeks. Some claimed to hear voices in the walls. Others begged to have their windows boarded up. A handful never left the wards, dying without clear cause. Paris records are more disturbing still. A single page survives from a lost police report, 3 bodies found along the Seine embankment. No wounds, no poison. Faces contorted, eyes wide, mouths open in silent scream. The description echoes the words of later eyewitnesses, who swore they saw people collapse in the street, clutching their chests, as though seized by terror itself. None of the corpses bore signs of plague. None fit the familiar patterns of epidemic. And yet, dozens died. Disappearances compound the mystery. In Krakow, church accounts note an unusual number of parishioners vanished in the spring of 1864. Families petitioned the clergy for prayers, but no bodies were ever found. Similar notes appear in municipal records in Dresden and Warsaw: missing workers, missing children, even entire households absent after a single night. The entries are brief, as though officials were reluctant to dwell on them. But taken together, they point to something chilling: whole lives swallowed by the panic, never recovered. The testimonies of families add further detail. One widow in Vienna swore that her husband left to check a noise outside their home and never returned. She found the door still open, his lantern dropped in the street, the flame extinguished. In Paris, a mother told neighbors that her teenage daughter disappeared after insisting she could see them through the shutters. The girl's bed was found empty the next morning, the shutters wide open. In many of these cases, the families were reluctant to press authorities. Fear of ridicule kept them silent. Fear of what might come if they spoke kept them silent longer. But the pattern endured in whispers, people not only dying of fright, but vanishing entirely, as though absorbed into the silence of 1864. Even more unsettling are the scattered medical autopsies. One report from a Vienna morgue describes a man in his 40s who died of unknown fright. The coroner noted no physical trauma, no poisoning, no disease. Yet the heart appeared overstrained, as though he had run for miles though found seated in his chair. Another report describes a woman with dilated pupils and ruptured blood vessels in the eyes, classic signs of extreme terror. Yet there was no attacker, no cause. Doctors of the era were baffled. Some attributed the deaths to hysteria, others to nervous collapse, still others to atmospheric changes. A few ventured darker theories, that the sufferers had glimpsed something so terrifying the body itself surrendered. These explanations were never published. The reports were buried in hospital archives, surviving only in fragments. But the medical handwriting remains clear: whatever killed these people, it was not disease alone. And then there are the anomalies. A letter from a Bavarian doctor describes a corpse found standing upright, rigid, eyes frozen wide. Another physician in Prague notes patients who refused to describe what they saw but begged to have their eyes covered before death. In one case, a man insisted that attendants blow out all lamps before he would allow them to approach. His final words: "It is brighter in the dark." The statistics, sparse though they are, suggest the panic was not harmless mass hysteria. In Vienna alone, the winter of 1864 saw a 20% increase in unexplained deaths compared to previous years. Berlin and Paris showed similar spikes, hidden within general mortality figures but detectable by careful comparison. Official reports never connected the numbers. Perhaps they dared not. But the correlation is hard to ignore. Disappearances, too, can be measured, though less precisely. In Krakow, the number of missing persons petitions tripled that year. In Warsaw, parish rolls show families quietly marked as absent, their fates unrecorded. In Dresden, municipal logs skip entire households without explanation. It is as though the panic swallowed not only individuals but whole lines of memory, erasing them as effectively as any government order. The most chilling evidence of all comes from the scattered diaries of physicians and priests. One Viennese doctor, whose official notes were careful and clinical, kept a private journal with a different tone. There he confessed, "I cannot deny what I have seen. Patients who scream at shadows, then die as if hearts burst from within. This is not madness alone. There is something in the streets." A Berlin priest's diary echoes the same unease: "I buried 3 today. Their faces were twisted not by plague, but by horror. Their families refused to say what they saw. I too am afraid to ask. When taken together, these fragments sketch a portrait too consistent to dismiss. In 1864, people not only feared, they died. They vanished. They left behind bodies that bore no wound except the unmistakable mark of terror. And yet, none of this appears in the official histories. Governments erased the reports. Universities ignored the anomalies. Doctors reclassified deaths as natural causes. Priests buried the victims in silence. It was safer, perhaps, to let the panic be forgotten than to admit something unexplainable had swept across Europe. But history does not erase so easily. In the cracks of the archive, in the margins of forgotten ledgers, the truth leaks through. The winter of 1864 was a season not only of fear, but of death. A season when silence covered corpses, and when memory itself was buried alongside the missing. Which leaves us with a terrifying question. If the panic killed and consumed people, if it left scars in records and bodies in morgues, what exactly were they facing? Was it hysteria amplified to lethal levels, or was there truly something in the night that could frighten the life out of those who saw it? To answer that, we must follow the trail into the modern era, where rare fragments and rediscovered documents have begun to resurface. Because the most unsettling detail of all is not what happened in 1864, but the possibility that it may happen again. For decades, the panic of 1864 remained little more than a rumor among the brave or the reckless few. The governments of Europe had buried the files. Scholars who dared to pursue the subject were silenced, ridiculed, or broken by their obsession. But the 20th century, with its wars and upheavals, cracked open archives long sealed. And in those cracks, the silence of 1864 began to whisper once more. It started, strangely enough, with an accident. In the aftermath of the Second World War, when Allied forces seized German records, millions of documents were shipped west for analysis. Among them was a misfiled folder marked simply, Public Disorder, 1864. Inside were half-burned reports, police memos, and fragments of testimony. The documents were scattered, incomplete, but chilling. One Berlin police inspector described entire neighborhoods locking their doors at night against the wanderers. Another noted a surge in suicides among otherwise healthy citizens, many leaving notes that read only, "I cannot stand the sound." The folder quickly vanished again into classified storage. But a copy, perhaps smuggled, perhaps simply overlooked, survived in the possession of a French archivist. Decades later, in the 1970s, the papers surfaced quietly in a university library. Few noticed, until a young doctoral student researching urban paranoia stumbled upon them. Her name was Marianne Delacroix, and she would become one of the first modern scholars to drag the forgotten winter back into light. Delacroix's thesis began cautiously, framed as a study of mass rumor and urban fear in 19th-century Europe. But her tone darkened as she analyzed the fragments. She argued that the uniformity of accounts across countries suggested something beyond rumor, a phenomenon not confined to one city but spreading like contagion. Her work met predictable resistance. Professors dismissed it as sensational. Critics accused her of weaving ghost stories into history. Yet her thesis gained a following outside academia. Independent researchers, journalists, even occult enthusiasts seized upon it. For the first time in over a century, 1864 had a voice again. Then came the second discovery. In the 1990s, a group of Czech historians working through neglected church archives found references to the cursed winter, buried in parish letters. One priest, writing to his superior in March 1864, described the silence that walks among houses, and begged for guidance. Another confessed that he had fled his parish entirely after seeing figures without faces pass through the cemetery. These were not folklore recorded generations later, they were contemporary voices, terrified and immediate. As news of these finds spread, so too did the unease. Journalists wrote cautious features on the forgotten panic. Television specials flirted with the subject, usually treating it as urban legend. But every rediscovery added weight to the silence. For if nothing had happened, why had governments sealed reports? Why had priests abandoned parishes, doctors rewritten death records, professors been mocked into exile? The more the story resurfaced, the more deliberate its erasure appeared. The digital age accelerated the unsealing. In the early 2000s, when European archives began digitizing 19th-century newspapers, researchers noticed curious patterns. Entire weeks of 1864 issues missing. Columns abruptly cut mid-sentence. Even surviving articles hinted at something strange, vague warnings to remain indoors, reports of unrest, without detail, obituaries describing unexplained passing. In one German paper, a tiny classified notice read simply, "They are gone. Keep the lamps lit." No context, no explanation. Some historians dismissed these fragments as quirks of record-keeping. But others pointed to the consistency. Why, across multiple countries, did the silence fall in the same months? Why were the missing weeks always clustered in February and March of 1864? Why did the obituaries spike? The anomalies multiplied until they could no longer be ignored. By 2010, a small but determined network of independent researchers began compiling everything: parish logs, police notes, scattered diaries, vanished student theses. They called themselves the Black Winter Group. Their goal was simple: to reconstruct the forgotten season piece by piece, no matter how fragmented. What they found disturbed even the skeptics. Correlating parish registers with hospital logs, they identified a statistically undeniable surge of unexplained deaths in early 1864 across at least 6 major cities. Comparing family genealogies, they noted sudden vanishings of entire lineages, households that simply ceased. And in private letters, preserved in dusty family attics, they uncovered first-hand testimonies never meant for the public. A mother in Paris wrote to her sister, "I hear them outside every night. I hold the children close. I pray the silence passes us by." A farmer in Bavaria scribbled in his almanac, "They are marching again. No faces. God protect us." Each fragment on its own could be dismissed as hysteria. But assembled together, they painted a picture as coherent as it was horrifying. The panic was not rumor. It was not legend. It was real, measurable, lethal, and deliberately hidden. Yet what unsettled researchers most was not the past, but the hints of recurrence. In scattered modern police reports, they found echoes, small outbreaks of unexplained fear. In 1938, a village in eastern Poland reported dozens refusing to leave homes, insisting shadows moved in the fields at night. In 1954, a rural French town described an outbreak of mass fainting after the humming was heard during Sunday service. In 1997, German newspapers briefly noted a cluster of disappearances in a single neighborhood of Dresden, never explained. Each event was localized, fleeting, quickly forgotten. But each bore the same hallmarks of 1864: silence, shadows, and faces twisted in terror. Delacroix herself hinted at this before her death in 2015. In a final interview, she admitted, "I no longer believe 1864 was unique. I think it was one eruption of something older, something that surfaces when conditions align. And I fear we may see it again." Her words haunt the Black Winter Group, who continue their work in secretive forums and encrypted exchanges. They argue that official denial is not mere embarrassment but protection, that governments continue to suppress the memory of 1864 because acknowledging it might invite its return. One member wrote anonymously, "It is not the past that frightens them. It is the possibility of repetition." And so, what began as fragments in burned police files has become a looming question: was 1864 a singular outbreak of hysteria, or a glimpse of something that still stalks the edges of European history? If it was mere fear, why does the fear repeat? If it was contagion, why does it leave no microbial trace? And if it was something else, something nameless, then what does it mean that modern echoes continue? The silence of 1864, once buried, is no longer silent. It speaks through archives, through lost letters, through the statistical anomalies of mortality tables. It speaks through those who dare to listen. And its voice carries a warning: what happened once may happen again. But there is one final piece of the story, a piece that may be the most chilling of all. Because scattered among the rediscovered files are references to prophecies, omens, and warnings that the panic was not random at all. That it was part of a cycle. A cycle that has not yet ended. And if those prophecies are true, the silence of 1864 may not remain confined to history. It may be waiting, once more, in the shadows of the present. The story of 1864 does not end in the archives, nor in the scattered diaries of priests and doctors, nor even in the rediscovered files of modern scholars. It ends, or perhaps it continues, with us. Because what makes the silence of that winter so chilling is not only what it did to Europe then, but what it suggests for the future. We have followed the fragments, the sudden mass panic that swept across cities and villages, the faceless figures whispered about by terrified children, the priests who fled, the doctors who buried their doubts in coded language. We have seen the investigators who dared to probe deeper, only to vanish into obsession or ridicule. We have examined the evidence of bodies, people who died of fright, people who disappeared without trace. And we have looked at the rediscoveries, the researchers who insisted the silence was not confined to the past. All of it points to one truth: the panic of 1864 was real. Something happened that year, something that terrified entire populations, left measurable deaths, and was powerful enough to erase itself from official memory. And yet, the true terror is not that it happened once. It is the possibility that it may happen again. Because if we listen closely, we hear echoes. Not only in the stray outbreaks of fear in 20th-century villages, not only in the testimonies of those who swore they heard the humming in later years. The echoes live in the statistics of today. Modern Europe has its own unexplained disappearances, its own sudden spikes in unexplained deaths. The data is buried in bureaucracy, scattered in reports no one wants to correlate, but the anomalies are there. And every so often, someone still whispers of shadows that move without bodies, of silence that presses in like a weight, of nights when the air itself seems to hum. It is easy, of course, to dismiss these as coincidences. To say that people are frightened by ordinary things, storms, wars, the stress of modern life. To laugh off the faceless figures as folklore that lingers in the imagination. But laughter does not erase the records. Jokes do not explain the deaths. Skepticism cannot account for the fact that the silence of 1864 was so carefully buried that generations grew up never hearing of it at all. And so we are left with an uncomfortable choice. Either we accept that Europe once experienced a continent-wide outbreak of fear so intense it killed and consumed people, and that this outbreak may return. Or we deny it all, consigning the fragments to the dust of archives, hoping that by refusing to look, we can keep the shadows at bay. But history has a cruel way of punishing denial. The plague, the wars, the famines, all were ignored, minimized, dismissed as rumors until they were too vast to hide. Why should 1864 be any different? Perhaps the reason the panic has been buried is not embarrassment, but dread that if too many remember, if too many speak its name, it will return sooner. The Black Winter Group, those modern collectors of fragments, believe the panic follows a cycle. They point to 1864, to the whispers of 1938, to the fainting in 1954, to the disappearances of 1997. They calculate a rhythm, a pulse of recurrence. And when they do the math, the result is unsettling. By their reckoning, the silence should be due again, now. Of course, we can dismiss them as alarmists. But what if they are right? What if the next outbreak is not confined to one village, one parish, one forgotten neighborhood? What if, as in 1864, it spreads across nations, sweeping through cities, erasing itself as it goes? What if the silence returns, not as history, but as the present? And what if it already has? Think of the unexplained blackouts, the sudden evacuations never fully reported, the neighborhoods cordoned off with vague phrases like structural safety concerns. Think of the people you've known who simply disappeared from conversation, their absence never explained. Think of the nights when the streets seem too quiet, when the air hums with something you cannot name. Think of the times you've sworn someone stood outside your window, though no shadow was there. These are coincidences, perhaps. But they are coincidences that echo too closely the fragments of 1864 to dismiss without unease. At the beginning of this story, we asked why historians are still afraid to talk about the panic of 1864. Now, at the end, the answer seems clearer. It is not that they fear ridicule. It is not that they lack evidence. It is because they know that silence is safer. That to drag the panic fully into light is to risk inviting it back. That to speak too plainly of it is to give it shape, and that shape may come walking again. So they remain silent. And perhaps we should too. But silence is not protection forever. The Faceless March was not destroyed in 1864, it passed. It waited. And if history is any guide, it waits still. Waiting for the lamps to go out. Waiting for the shutters to open. Waiting for the night when we forget to be afraid. And when that night comes, perhaps you will hear it first not in the street, but in the silence around you. Perhaps in the hum that should not be there. Perhaps in the sudden stillness of a crowded room. Perhaps in the glance of a stranger whose face seems, for a heartbeat, not to belong. Remember then the winter of 1864. Remember the priests who fled, the doctors who buried their doubts, the families who locked their doors. Remember the silence that kills. Because if the panic comes again, it will come as it always has, without warning, without reason, and without mercy. And above all, remember this, history's greatest mysteries are not the ones we fail to solve. They are the ones we are not allowed to speak of. The silence of 1864 was not broken by accident. It was buried for a reason. Perhaps that reason is fear. Or perhaps it is mercy. Either way, the silence still waits.